People do not expect dark from Disney. They expect uplift and optimism.
Right, exactly.
Struggles and challenges, but in the end, again, good always triumphs, evil's always defeated. But they know storytelling. And I should also say that I mentioned this in the book. It's not Disney, but it's Katzenberg. Katzenberg always wanted to do the Moses Exodus story, and he was unable to bring it to fruition at Disney. So when he left and founded DreamWorks, his first project was Prince of Egypt. And everything that he had learned from broadening the palette at Disney, he did with Prince of Egypt. He brought in, you know, Jewish, Christian, Muslim people, uh, theologians, and academics. The very beginning, he showed them storyboards, excuse me, and he took many of their suggestions and changed things.
So, Staten Islander news organization is here with Mark Pinsky. Journalist and author Mark I. Pinsky was born in Miami, Florida in 1947 and raised in the southern New Jersey suburbs in a conservative Jewish home where he was active in United Synagogue Youth. Pinsky began as a journalist in the mid 1960s at the Duke University Chronicle. The Readable Radical was one of his columns, and after graduation, he moved on to the local underground press, Protean Radish, Carolina Plain Dealer. He also freelanced for national leftist and progressive publications, including The Nation, The Progressive, New Left Notes, and The Village Voice. Contemporaneously, he covered the North Carolina legislature as a probationary staff writer for the Associated Press in Raleigh until he was fired for being arrested at the May Day anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C. in 1971 while on his day off. During this time, he was also contributing book reviews to the Raleigh News and Observer and Greensboro Daily News. After graduating from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in 1972, he started stringing from North Carolina and around the Southeast for the national desk of the New York Times and other major East Coast and UK newspapers, wire services, and commercial all-news and public radio stations. Throughout the 1970s, his reporting specialties were racial justice, murder, capital punishment, economic development, and occupational health and safety, and Judaism in the South. While his journalism career has spanned decades, Pinsky is probably best known as the author of the best-selling The Gospel According to the Simpsons, The Spiritual Life of the World's Most Animated Family, and is also the author of The Gospel According to Disney, Faith, Trust, and Pixie Dust, A Jew Among the Evangelicals, A Guide for the Perplexed, and Amazing Gifts, Stories of Faith, Disability, and Inclusion. So most of today's interview is actually going to focus on the gospel according to Disney. And good morning, Mark. It's great to have you with us this morning.
It's great to be here. And who's that old guy to the side of it?
So the first question was just kind of because a lot of people have used this same term, Judeo-Christian values, and nobody really defines what they mean by it. And I really get the feeling like everybody means something different. So I just wanted to ask, can you please expand on what you mean by Judeo-Christian values, which is referenced multiple times in your books and articles?
Um, During the early period of Disney, which is the Roy and Walt period, Judeo-Christian values were never explicit in the full-length animated films, but they were always implicit. And basically, the values that come out of the Ten Commandments and the New Testament as well. They never said Ten Commandments. They never said Jesus or the New Testament, but it was always implicit in the storylines that went with it. That changed during the Eisner-Katzenberg era when they began to bring in value systems from other faith traditions, including Muslim and Hindu and animist traditions. They broadened the theological spectrum. Again, during Walt and Roy's period, they developed what I have called the Disney Gospel, and its elements are fairly simple, but they're not necessarily explicit. So here are the elements. Good is always rewarded, evil is always punished. Number one. Number two, faith in faith. That is a belief in some higher power, which is not necessarily explicitly religious. It could be magic, it could be wishing upon a star, it could be fairy godmother. And the third element of the Disney gospel is that if you are good and if you call on a higher power and do your best, you will be rewarded. That's the guarantee that Walt made to parents, I think, of young children. And underlying that is an ethos of optimism, is what I call it. Um, it's always going to come out okay. There's always going to be a happy ending, unlike real life, that is not always the case. So there it is. And those underlying values continued under Katzenberg and Eisner, but again, the palette, the landscape was broadened to include other faith traditions that Walt and Roy ignored, for example.
So, what made you become interested in kind of analyzing Disney movies?
Well, as you know, journalists are our personal lives tend to be fodder for our professional lives. And so I had two young children at that time. And as parents will, as my parents did, we began watching the animated films. In those days was on well, VHS. And, and unlike when I was growing up, when you would see these once in the theater, perhaps, and then as the 50s and 60s came on, you would see it maybe once a year or twice a year on the TV show, the NBC Wide World of Disney. By this time, the technology had advanced so that you could watch these over and over and over again. And so I sat with my two children. I think they were about, I would say, maybe 3, 4, and 7. And I wanted to be a responsible parent, so we watched. And as we watched, I noticed these themes that were underlying all of these shows. And by that time, I was a religion journalist. So I thought, ah, there's a story for you. And it became first a story for my newspaper, which after I left the Los Angeles Times was the Orlando Sentinel. I wrote an article about it. It didn't talk about my kids particularly, but about the themes within the Disney world, and that ultimately became the book.
Oh,
Now, I
awesome.
hasten to say I don't claim to have discovered this because there were other people who were writing about it, mostly academics rather than journalists, and so what they wrote about it did not get a wide audience. But with newspapers, from my newspaper, then my article got picked up by other syndicates, and so um, and again that led to the book. Being a parent led to the book.
Okay, awesome. And do you yourself enjoy watching the Disney movies in addition to analyzing them?
Well, at some point, it's hard to separate business from pleasure. And so after I wrote the book, when subsequent animated films came out, I felt sort of obligated to watch them and to add to what I'd written in the book in newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and other places. It was more of a proprietary thing than anything else. I will say that we lived. We then when we were in Orlando, we were right in the midst of Disney World, and my wife worked for a time as a cast member, not in costume. She taught photography there, so we could go whenever we wanted. And I remember we left one movie. I guess my son was about 9 or 10. He said, "I'm done with Disney. I'm not watching any of these anymore." So then we stopped. So it was more business than pleasure. And again, it's hard at some points to sort of separate those strands. I mean, I was more, I did it not for escape, but for work, essentially, to maintain my brand.
I wanted to be a Disney animator and I thought it'd be the greatest thing ever. And then you realize that I actually met my partner and kind of came to the realization that if you work for them and you are behind the scenes, you kind of destroy the magic
Right.
of the movies themselves. And so, like, that was kind of one of the reasons why I just decided not to continue to pursue that, like, because I didn't want to destroy that for myself. I was like,
Absolutely.
it's there's other things you could do, like, so but that's interesting that that you do watch them more professionally, but you do like them, but it's more of like a professional kind of thing at this point.
Yes.
So, would you describe some of the religious symbolic aspects of one or two of the Disney films of your choice?
Well, it's always good, I think, and instructive to begin with Snow White, because that was the big breakthrough, one of the first ones, if not the first one. Um, and you had this kind of apposition of Snow White and the evil stepmother and the witch. So it's a real very clear dichotomy of who's good and who's bad, who's innocent and who's really guilty in certain ways of bad things like envy, for example. The stepmother envies the beauty of Snow White, but her sort of pure innocence and her resorting to the supernatural saves her and allows her to succeed. Um, in the more modern ones, I would say I liked what they did with The Hunchback of Notre Dame for a number of reasons. One, it's based on Victor Hugo's novel, which was strongly anti-clerical. He wrote in the times that he wrote, and so the villain in the original was the chief minister of the cathedral. When Disney did it, they kind of stood that on its head, and they made him a secular official, a magistrate, and the person who headed uh, the 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 congregation was a good person, ineffectual but a good person. And as you go through it, there are elements of tolerance and the Holocaust. There are some scenes where they try to root out the gypsies, and it's hard for any adult to watch that and not see that and see in it echoes of the Holocaust. Again, with Disney, without being explicit, but the message is there for those who will see it. And again, even though it was an anti-clerical novel in the film, Esmeralda is supported and gets inspiration from the stained glass windows. Again, which again turned Victor Hugo's novel on its head, but it made it a more pro-religious message, I think. And those two stick out in my mind.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because one of the other things that's really interesting to me about Disney is they created that whole everything that they had. Like before Snow White, you had gag reels. They would have gag reels before every movie in the theater, but that was it. It was like everything would stretch and, they didn't look like real people. And then what Disney ended up doing was creating a whole new art form, which now everybody, it exploded, it took off, it became like a very kind of, I guess, American type of thing where they kind of figured everything out, and then just other people, other studios came in and started doing animation for more than gag reels too. So I think that was awesome that they did that.
Right. I think also that form, which we now call 2D, hand drawn, created very realistic, lifelike characters. What has kind of disturbed me a little bit is some of the modern stuff is CGI, and they don't, to me, they don't have the charm of the hand drawn ones. But I
There's
don't want
actually so many. so many nuances to that, like, because the CGI, to me, it's actually kind of like I love the stories, so I still watch them, but it's like watching a bunch of dolls running around and interacting with each other. And I'm like, they're so plastic looking. They have plastic shines on their faces. And it's just like, but then one of the things that Disney did was the company that makes the animation, I think they're called Maya 3D, and they paid Maya 3D millions of dollars to fix this issue that all the other Maya 3D animations have, which is the eyes.
Right.
The eyes look like I would say almost a cross between a sun and a sparkly thing or
Right.
something. So it just looks freaky when
Right.
in other animated movies when they do a close up on the eyes, it always looks freaky, but on Disney movies it doesn't because they got them to fix that problem, but nobody else can use the fix.
And a lot of these things involve money, if not most or all of them. And it's a lot cheaper to do it that way than to either do hand drawn or simulate hand drawn. And
Hmm.
so, and again, when in the old days of Disney, they would come out, might be working on 3 or 4 features, and one a year would come out. Now there's this insatiable demand for their product, and there's also the Disney Channel. So it's not just, theaters, which they almost never open anymore, but on streaming services and on cable. And so the maw of demand is so great on production. I guess they would say they need to do that because they don't have enough money or people to do all these things by hand drawing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I actually had read years ago The Illusion of Life, which is a coffee table book. It's gigantic, it's thick, um, and it describes how the studio evolved and how long those 2D movies would take, the 3 or 4 years
Right.
to just make one. And so they had like them, like you were saying, like stacked back to back to back, like so that they could get them out every year. But it was in this behind the scenes, like, and if you ever went to, I don't know if they have this anymore, I don't think they have this anymore at Disney World, where you could watch the animators working,
Right.
because they don't really do that anymore. You're going to watch somebody on the computer being like,
Yeah.
like that. It's not as entertaining anymore when they're not doing it by hand. So what is the most important takeaway that people, including parents, can have about Disney's films and the company as a whole from your writings and research?
Well, the first thing that the parents always want to know is it safe for my kids to watch? And my answer is yes. The caveat I would put on that is that during the Walt and Roy era, it was a very white-centric world. They weren't racist, except for maybe the crows in Dumbo, but it was a white, ostensibly Protestant world. And I think the really gift of Eisner and Katzenberg was that they included other cultures. Now, um, it was said that Walt didn't include explicit Christian symbols in his early works, partly because he said he didn't want children from Asia and Africa to feel excluded. Um, but that would also mean, excluded, that means not buying tickets to go to see his movies. Under Eisner and Katzenberg, they began gradually to add different cultures. Mulan was Asian. Uh, uh, Pocahontas was animist. Um, and there were others, so that kids from other cultures would see themselves on that screen and be included. So I guess in given the modern era, I would say the Eisner Katzenberg era and beyond, the people who've succeeded them, are probably the safest and the most encouraging of the full-length animated films. So you had, The Princess and the Frog, which include African Americans, first African American princess, Patricia Note Voodoo, and gradually they introduced all these elements, and so parents can feel even safer, particularly parents who aren't, white Christians.
Right, right. And then, so can you explain why there is so much symbolism of various spiritual traditions in the Disney movies?
Well, the expansion that we just talked about, I think, is partially a change in our culture. Disney has always tracked changes in the culture. They haven't anticipated change in the culture, particularly in the matter of inclusion. And I think part of that was because that's the spirit of the company and the animators. They felt the changes and they felt the change in the culture should be represented on the screen, but also always with Disney, there's the commercial aspect. If you broaden the palette, then you're going to include more people. And now, unlike the early Walt and Roy years, there's so much more competitive product out there. So you have to earn it. And one way I think they want to earn that larger audience, which means more profits for the company, is to include many other cultures. I think it's been a very salutary effect.
Awesome. And why do you expect that a lot of people who view the movies do just miss the symbolic aspects?
Well, I think one reason they might miss it. I would say one reason why they miss it because it's always blended into the narrative. It's not in your face. It's not explicit. On the other hand, given the fact that kids can watch and listen over and over again, even the most subtle of messages breaks through to the kids. They may not know what values are being transmitted to them, but they are. Not by design of the company. The company always soft pedaled symbolism and religious values. But the kids watching them over and over again, or hearing the songs over and over again, I think that reinforces that subtle message. And so it becomes almost explicit.
Right, from repeating it and stuff, because I've noticed that myself is like because I actually watch the movies again and again and again, and you always see something new or something different or something that you maybe missed before. So, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And what do you think of the representations of different religions than Judeo-Christian in the films made during the Eisner and Katzenberg years, such as Pocahontas, Mulan, and Brother Bear? And you had touched on this a little bit before about how they are kind of, more inclusive and showing other faiths and stuff like that.
Well, I think that given the times, given the changes in the culture, they were very, very careful to know what they were describing, to research these different faith traditions. And I don't know this to be a fact, but I'm assuming they brought in people from those faith traditions to inform it and show them the sketches and show them the short segments as it being done. In the old days, they would make the movies, and just a week before they were going to premiere, they would bring in the faith leaders and say, "What do you think?" Well, that doesn't help you a whole lot, in terms of fixing things, because you can't. They brought people much earlier on into the process, and there was one very significant misstep, and that was Aladdin. They caricatured Arab culture, if not Islam, um, and there was a big furor about that. Uh, the Arab observers and academics were felt like they were offended. And in something that Disney doesn't usually do, they went back and they made some changes after the film had been released. Um, some of the songs about we've cut off your nose and cut off your hand, stuff like that. Um, they substituted different lyrics for that. And I think that was a learning experience for them going forward, so that they didn't want to make that mistake ever again. And that meant they did their homework, did their research, didn't go for a caricature or a cheap laugh. And I think you can see that in the evolution of these films. And you see that people from these faith groups who are not involved in the production say this is very good. we understand, we know that you consulted people, and that, it brings in a bigger audience. I mean, we're changing in the US, and Disney's always been a worldwide brand. So, if you're fairly representing, Buddhism, you know, um, that's going to help you with your Asian markets. So I think that Disney's always learned. The only analogous situation I can recall is and this was not a full-length animated film, this was a short, and that is Three Little Pigs, done in the 30s or 40s. And the big bad wolf in the earlier versions of it was a Jewish peddler, identifiably Jewish peddler with a Yiddish accent. And at the time, people were very upset. And whenever initially when the company is criticized, they circle the wagons. They say, "No, you don't understand. This was innocent. We're not doing this. We were doing that." But ultimately, they made that version of Three Little Pigs unavailable. They put it in the safe, and then later they made some changes. Ironically, they changed the Big Bad Wolf into an Irish peddler, right, rather than a Jewish peddler. But again, they did learn from that mistake.
Right, right. And I know like there was a book about Pocahontas, The Art of Pocahontas. So the book, The Art of Pocahontas, talked about how they did interview. There were two women from the tribe, the Powhatan tribe, that they interviewed to, kind of make sure that they got the spirituality correct and all of that stuff right, in the movie. And I know a lot of people ended up being Pocahontas ended up being somewhat of a misstep too, because that's not how it ended in real life. And a lot of
So,
people got very offended by that. This is like, no, it didn't go happily ever after. And it's, you
she
know,
married the guy. She married the other guy. So, but that's also true because, as I mentioned with Victor Hugo, if the source material doesn't fit their story rubric, they change it. You know, and also like Pinocchio was in the originals much darker, and they don't do dark. Disney doesn't do dark. The one time they did it was on in Elements of Fantasia, um, and that did not do well at all. People do not expect dark from Disney. They expect uplift and optimism.
right, exactly.
Struggles and challenges, but in the end, again, good always triumphs, evil's always defeated.
Right, right. And do you feel the studio at the time? I know that you had mentioned in your book that, and also in this just before, that the Eisner and Katzenberg years, they tried to represent religion without caricaturing it. Do you think that for the most part they were able to accomplish that?
I do. I do. Now, I come from the Jewish tradition, so that's my viewpoint. Although I've written about all religions, it's people on the inside of those faith traditions who are the ones we should rely on about whether they got it, whether they got it right. But I think they've been working hard at it, and they didn't want any more mistakes, like like Aladdin or like elements of Pocahontas. And they do storytelling very well. I mean, you can
Yeah, they
criticize
do.
elements of it, but they know storytelling. And I should also say that I mentioned this in the book. It's not Disney, but it's Katzenberg. Katzenberg always wanted to do the Moses Exodus story, and he was unable to bring it to fruition at Disney. So when he left and founded DreamWorks, his first project was Prince of Egypt, and everything that he had learned from broadening the palette at Disney, he did with Prince of Egypt. He brought in, Jewish, Christian, Muslim people, uh, theologians, and academics. The very beginning, he showed them storyboards, excuse me, and he took many of their suggestions and changed things. So by that time, these religious leaders had buy-in. By bringing them into the process, they had buy-in. So when Prince of Egypt opened around the country, evangelical churches, they rented buses and they bought out theaters for showings. And it's, uh, you know, they they uh, they did well by doing good, as they say.
Right,
It was the
right.
right thing to do, but it paid off actually also.
No, that's good. Um, so there was something interesting that you had spoken about in your book, and I'd like to ask you to expand on this concept that people believe that belief in God, regardless of specific faith, is necessary to be moral, and the American value system spiritualized.
Yes, I guess I would say that I would, in retrospect, I would say belief in a higher power, regardless of what you call it. There was a sociologist named Will Herberg in the 50s who wrote about, he said America's civic religion was faith in faith. That is, if you resort to this higher power will come through for you. And it didn't matter. He once wrote a book called Protestant Catholic Jew about America's civic religion. And that's what he said. It doesn't, you don't, some people are different, but in most cases, you don't have to believe in Jesus, for example, or God, or, I mean, if you call God's name Allah, it's still the same God, but it's a higher power. And Disney broadened that further by saying they didn't want to be exclusive in representing that higher power. Um, so it was magic, good magic for the most part. A Wish Upon a Star, Fairy Godmother, all those things. And um, and this is not new. This is not new to America or to the West. If you look back at classic Greek drama, they always had what was known as Deus ex machina, which is some supernatural power that intervenes to resolve the story. And in some cases, it was an actor in a basket being lowered onto the stage and intervening and making things right and then going back up again. So it predates most faiths, most organized faiths, except for Judaism. But yeah, so I mean, it's a storytelling device also, and yes.
Oh, awesome. Because there aren't any overtly great gay friendly attitudes or themes in Disney movies. But how do you feel the company has gained such a reputation as being pro homosexuality?
I think it is a function of the company's workforce and the fact that the bulk of the work is done in Burbank, California, and Californians have tended in recent decades to be more progressive than other people. And I think it's the workforce, including the animators, who have pushed in that direction. So the origin of the great Disney boycott of the 1990s was when the company pioneeringly, I would say, offered health benefits to domestic partners, same-sex domestic partners, and that set off a number of things. But they were doing it in other ways too. Their publishing arm published a book called Heather Has Two Mommies, for example, uh, about a lesbian couple. So it was like little by little they were doing it, and they haven't taken the big step, which is kind of at the end, which would be an animated feature with a clearly gay character or gay characters uh, shown in a positive light. I think, well, as I said earlier, Disney tracks change in the culture. It doesn't anticipate changes in the culture. So now that we have in recent years gay marriage and all sorts of openness and in the larger world, the larger North American world, it makes it then easier it looks like Disney's catching up rather than breaking barriers. But that's been the sort of that's the evolution of that as I see it, and I think it is probably only a matter of time. And it may be, for example, what they typically would do, and this was also the case with live action sitcoms from all the networks. They will typically begin with subsidiary characters, the sidekick, one of the people in the ensemble, sort of I think to get people acculturated to see that gay people are part of American society now. I think if there's not significant blowback when that happens, then the really crucial point will be when they make a full-length animated film with gay people at the center of it. And then that's a kind of cultural marker for society. When it happens, the culture has changed. A lot of the old bigots and racists, are going to have to die, frankly, before that's complete. But that's the way I see it unfolding.
Okay. And do some religious groups tend to find the specifically pagan symbolism sometimes used in Disney's films, such as representations of the five elements in Frozen 2, or some of the scenes in Fantasia problematic? And how can this be reconciled for them?
Well, I think that the example is the mid 1990s Southern Baptist boycott of Disney over the whole spectrum, including different representations, and the fact that there weren't specific Christian symbolism. But the culture's moving on, I think, and I think I think they saw that the boycott was a failure, both economically. They didn't get Disney to backtrack, and it didn't make them look very tolerant. And I think that lesson has been learned. And I think to do that would lead them open to more caricature, I think, and to more um, opprobrium by more moderate people, which is, I think, now the vast majority of the American people. I think that would be a loser for them to complain about that. Because, I mean, pagan life was once, before Jesus was before Judaism was a part of the culture. You can't say that that wasn't the case. And there are still some people, who are either animist or what we would call pagan, which I think is a pejorative term, which I probably wouldn't use today if I wrote the book today. Um, I think it's like they're trying to deny reality if they complained about pagan representation.
Right. And then overall, what is most critical for people to understand about the symbolism and magic that's present in the Disney films?
One, that it's until recently non-specific. It's it's inclusive. It is increasingly inclusive, and it's supportive of the positive aspects of spirituality. They're not anti-religion. They're not anti-Christian because they represent other faith traditions. Um, to my knowledge, or my experience, no faith tradition is denigrated in the Disney full-length animated films or now the TV series. Um, it's always a matter of uplift and presenting the favorable aspects of whatever faith tradition they are putting on the screen, big screen or small screen.
Cool. And how do you feel that Disney films have contributed positively to our society? So, like, in what ways have Disney films contributed positively?
I think basically it's the optimistic element of all Disney full-length animated films. People may face challenges, but um, if they're optimistic, it's it's somewhat illusory, but it says that the world is a good place. And if you do good things, bad things won't happen to you, which, as we know as adults, is not always true. So in that sense, it may be illusory, it may mislead, but as a child, as much positive feelings that you can generate and incorporate into entertainment, I think it makes for a healthier child. You can see shortcomings here and there in the early ones, particularly. But I think to return the first thing I said, I think was that parents can feel safe with their kids watching these things. The kids will, I think, try to be better people as a result of watching these things, and that's my big takeaway.
Oh, fantastic. And then, in reference to your two books about the gospel and the Simpsons, you said it's not what it seems. So, in reference to your two books about the gospel and the Simpsons, you said it's not what it seems. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. When The Simpsons first came on TV, I was working for the Los Angeles Times in Orange County, and I wrote about protests by parents of this sort of anti-authoritarian streak, particularly embodied by Bart, and the fact that the George Bush the first made some disparaging remarks about it, and Barbara Bush made some disparaging remarks about it. And so that was the way people who never watched the show understood the show to be. And that element has always been a part of it for the next 30 or 40 years. But again, I began with my children, and my children came to me. When they were growing up, we didn't watch TV during the week in our house, and we didn't let them, and we modeled that, but we didn't watch it either. Sports may be exception to that. But they reached the age of Bart and Lisa, and in the summer they said, we want to watch The Simpsons. And in those years, um, between the new shows and the syndicated old shows, you could pretty much see it 7 days a week, even before streaming. And I tried to be a responsible parent. I said, okay, here's what we'll do. We'll sit together, the three of us, and I'll have the remote. And if there are things that I think are objectionable, we'll stop. And my concern was not so much the anti-authoritarian element, which still remained, but was not that prominent because Bart kind of receded over the years as a central character. I was concerned about language maybe, and also how sexuality was portrayed on the screen. And as happened before with Disney, as I watched with them, I found that the show and the family were really pro-religion. I mean, they made some fun of it in one of the characters, Ned Flanders, and the minister. But overall, religion was a positive part of their life and a central part of their life. For a time, that was the most religion played a larger part in that show than any other show on TV. I mean, they said grace at meals. They went to church every Sunday. Their next door neighbor was an evangelical, and they were believers, different kinds of believers. And Homer was a borderline pagan. He was unclear on the doctrine, but Marge was very religious in a sincere way. Um, Lisa was a, a, a quester. She was on a religious and spiritual journey, sincere one. And so that was a sort of head snapping reaction I had to watching that. So as I said, your personal life becomes fodder for your professional life if you're a journalist. And I reached for the legal pad and began taking notes as we watched together. And then I thought, well, maybe the ones that I was watching, maybe the episodes I was watching were not representative. So I went out and I bought a compilation of the previous years of the show, which each one had a page, 2 pages for a plot summary. And I thought, no, this is not unrepresented. This is an element of the show. And I think because was so counterintuitive to what people thought the show was about, who didn't watch it. I mean, those who watched it with their kids, including evangelicals, said, "You're right. You know, you're right about that. And that's why we keep watching it together." It's kind of a bonding experience often for fathers and adolescent boys, I found in my research. And that I think, propelled the book to the success it had because it was so counterintuitive. I mean, the first book was published on September 1st, 2001. So we had a clear field until 10 days, um, uh, 11 days. And when the towers fell, like everybody else in the publishing business, we shut down for three months because people didn't want to hear anything but 9/11. But unlike some of the books that came out that fall season, we picked right up. I mean, on a given day, I could be on a shock jock radio station and a Christian radio station because not because the book was such a great book, but because the show had such a constituency that cut across many areas because it was so, again, head-snappingly counterintuitive. But it was only for people who never watched the series. The people who watched the series, they knew it, although some watched it and didn't realize it. But that's the American viewing public. But so yeah, that's how that happened. No, my children led me to this.
Yeah, and it's really funny because I don't think that they thought when they first made that show that it would become the longest running animated series on television. And I don't think that when Disney made Frozen, I don't think they expected it to be the number one top grossing animated film of all time. Like, who
Yeah.
would have thought that that would have happened? I was like, wow, okay, that's pretty cool because, it kind of goes into such universal themes. Like, especially with Frozen, with like everyone who saw Frozen who had a sister or was a sister, they loved it. They loved that movie because they saw themselves in the sisters,
Right.
and I feel like it was the first Disney movie that showed true love as something not between a boy and a girl, so it made it very, very unique, and that maybe that contributed to its success too, because it was so different than anything Disney had done before or anything anyone else had done before.
And there was beautiful music as well. I mean, there's so many elements to a successful Disney animated film. It all begins with the writing. Speaking as a writer, it all begins with the writing and the script and how they develop that. And then there's the artwork, of course, but the music, which has really been inspirational, almost been funny too, but it's been inspirational.
Hmm.
Um, and the kids can listen to those songs and sing the songs after a while, enough to drive
Yeah.
the parent who's driving crazy, but that's
And they do, yeah. Their music is incredible, and actually my own favorite one, my favorite movies are Sleeping Beauty and Frozen 2, which I don't know if you ended up seeing Frozen 2. But I don't like Frozen 1 myself particularly. It's very wrenching, I guess you would say, like, with the death of the parents in the first 10 minutes, and they don't come back. So it's kind of like it's a little bit depressing in that regard. It's kind of harder to watch for that reason. But the second one was really, really good, and I feel like they had to make the first one to make the second one, and usually it doesn't work out that well that a sequel does almost as well or even better than the first one. But in the case of Frozen, the sequel did amazingly well too, which was great. So, and the other question that I had about The Simpsons was, do you also feel that The Simpsons has contributed positively to our society, and why and in what ways?
absolutely. I think their spiritual world not only is more religious than people thought and more reflective of the faith lives of most Americans, but they think they have taught people in middle America step by step about who the Jews are, what the Jews believe, who the Muslims are, who the Buddhists are, people who had never encountered, who the Hindus are, people who in maybe middle America who never met a Jew, never met a Hindu, never met a Buddhist. Um, by introducing them, usually through subsidiary characters to get them used to them and to really promote um, a genuine sense of tolerance, I think. And I think that's one of their main gifts to America. And you know, that song from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, I think, where a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And the fact that it's each of these messages are wrapped in a joke. They're 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 entertaining. They're not preachy. And people, I used to say that, when people are watching, it's my experience, and they know that it's about religion or about faith, this little sort of filter goes down. It's a sort of a filter of skepticism. But when it's an entertainment show and it's well done, that filter drops away, and their minds open. And sometimes they don't even know what their minds are open to, which makes it even more effective.
Right, right. And actually, one of the reasons I had asked you if you enjoy watching the Disney movies was because there were actually a couple of movies that I had seen recently that came out of the Ukraine. I'm not sure if you were familiar with them. Was just released last year. It was Mavka, the Forest Song.
Hmm.
It's incredible. It's very beautiful. And it was interesting because back in February of 2022, I was just checking the email the other day. 14 days before the Ukraine invasion, they were announcing that they were going to have the film at some film festivals in June of that year, which didn't happen because of the invasion. But then last year, I just was like, let me see if they ever released it. And it turns out in May, they finally released it in last year. And I finally did get to see it, and I highly recommend it. It's amazing. And they actually used the eye problem to advantage in the Mavka story because they only focused on her eyes, which should look like that, which should be sparkly and sun-like and stuff just because of what she is as the character. So, and I also wanted to ask, do you have anything else that you would like to add?
No, I mean, it's been a long time. I wrote the book, I guess, in '04, I believe. So it's 20 years now. And I maintain a sort of proprietary brand interest in that subject, but less so. I don't think I've written about newer releases in recent years. So I've kind of moved on to other subjects. There's a segment of my career which was uh, the intersection of faith and popular culture. So thus the Disney book, thus the Simpsons book, and essays I've done for other people about other platforms, about attempts to do that, both Disney and non-Disney, and also for the Disney TV shows. Disney has, I can't remember the name of the show, but I wrote about it. They had the first Jewish princess. So those kind of breakthroughs. And before that, I wrote about the first African American princess and the princess and the frog. And when it, in my view, when it says something about recognizing or ratifying a change in the culture, then I try to step up and add what I can to the subject with given my perspective. I mean, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, I'm just a journeyman newspaper guy. Um, but I'm also a parent, and just my daughter had our first grandchild, so I'm already gearing up for that. She can't talk yet, but I'll preparing the way if I can. So I assume I'll do the same thing with my granddaughter that I did with my children, and try to watch these with them and maybe offer a commentary. In the book, um, it's also kind of a parent's guide. So I go feature by feature and kind of advise parents what to be on the lookout for, what to emphasize for, at what point maybe to stop it and explain why people were presented in this way or not or were absent. And again, the same soft sell, that a parent or grandparent would give, but put it in context. And I think as we go through the canon, if we do, um, the further along the canon we go, the less explanation will be necessary.
Right, right. Okay, well, it was really, really great meeting with you today, and uh, this was really very informative. I think that our readers will really enjoy this. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us.
Oh, happy to do it. And it's really great to have someone who knows what she's talking about and who has an interest in the subject that predates the book.
I'm really
And
glad we were able to have this conversation.
I mean, for these people, what you say is, well, the marketplace is never wrong. And as long as people keep buying, and God forgive me, those princess dolls, uh, Disney's going to be around and it's going to be a part of the culture. It won't dominate the way it did when it was the only game in town. That's over. But if they produce quality product like Frozen 2, um, you know, if you build it, they will come, as they say.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually something about Disney is they never cut corners and they go all out in most of the things that they do. They do it the right way. Whereas I know like, some other makers and stuff like that, they kind of try to cut corners and stuff, but Disney never does that. So
No,
that's always good too.
yeah, the process can be like watching sausage be made, but it is a process, and they understand the process. And any project that gets to the screen, you know, went through all these processes. Some tried and true, some new, but the product in the end speaks for itself. If people buy it in our society, our capitalist society, it's good. If they don't, so.
Right, right. All right, it was great to speak with you.